Hi, thank you for coming to today's event. We are joined by an amazing fellow, Frank Lavin, former ambassador to Singapore, but you probably know him a little bit in a different context. He's here to talk about his new book, Inside the Reagan White House, from time in the Reagan administration. Frank has served across multiple presidents. We're so happy that he is here to join us in person. And to those of you joining us online in our Let's Find Common Ground podcast, on Zoom or on Facebook, thank you for tuning in as well. I will now kick it off to Frank. He'll go ahead and get started, and then we'll open it up to some questions for our live audience. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Diego. Thanks so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And look, most important in that very generous introduction, most important is the fact that I'm brought to USC by Diego and his team at the Center for Political Future. I've served as a fellow there over the semester, teaching or leading a seminar, I guess we say, on statecraft, on government leadership and decision making and so forth, some of which stems from my experience with Ronald Reagan, some of which stems from other administrations I've worked in, or just general historical episodes. But it's been a lot of fun working with the students, and I love the seminar format, and maybe we can recapture some of that today, where everything's sort of open architecture. We talk about anything, but I thought I'd lead by just setting the table, setting the historical basis for the 1980s, and talking about in what ways that might be relevant today. And actually, I started reflecting on this conversation early this year, because it was the Jimmy Carter funeral and memorial service. And it just brought home to me is, how do we evaluate a president in any event? How do we come to determination about this fellow did a good job or didn't do a good job, or tried his best or fell short here? But on what basis is that a fair summary? And what the Carter funeral reminded me of, that I thought the most common approach I think most people have regarding a president, presidential performance, is simply, do they more or less agree with this person's policies? Which is not a surprising approach, but it's not really analysis. It's not really, doesn't really answer the broader questions about, well, did he do a good job, or did his policies work anyways, or in what ways might he have fallen short? So what I thought the most useful use of our time here is just to delineate a few aspects of the Reagan presidency that I think are still relevant today. Some issues he grappled with, or themes he grappled with, that we see still part of the American political debate today. And I think there's some parallels, and I think there's also some sharp differences, not just between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, but with intervening presidents as well. Some areas he had in common, he didn't. I'll give you just a word of background, just to elaborate a bit on Diego's very kind introduction. I got out of college, class of '79. I worked for Reagan as a volunteer in his 1980 presidential campaign. I went right to work in the transition office in November 1980, or after he won, as a volunteer. I went right to work in the White House in January '81 as he was inaugurated as a volunteer, but within 2 months I was on payroll. And I spent most of those 8 years with Reagan in the Reagan White House. The first 2 years in the personnel office, where I really started as a file clerk, and it was all paper-based, non-digital systems, but literally photocopying resumes, filing resumes, retrieving resumes, facilitating the interview process, something like 100,000 resumes, 100,000 inquiries for about 2,000 non-career, 2,000 political appointees in the federal government. All had to be processed, dealt with, worked with, interviewed, and so forth. So that was my first 2 years. The second 2 years, '83, '84, I moved to the Office of Public Liaison. I attained some kind of mid-career, mid-level status as associate director of the office. And this is the outreach office that deals with different constituencies, different professional groups, trade associations, ethnic religious groups, other kind of lifestyle groups. And it's a pre-internet era. So the best way to talk to certain demographics is through their organizational structure. The only way you can talk to veterans is through veterans organizations. The only way you can talk to Catholics thematically, of course, but you also want to work with Catholic NGOs in the church structure itself, to talk through all sorts of different mechanisms to reach the Catholic community. But there's no social media or affinity groups that you can reach. You have to do direct communication with different organizations. So So that was through the '84 re-election campaign where Reagan's running for re-election against Walter Mondale, who had served as Jimmy Carter's vice president. The next 2 years, '85, '86, I was at the National Security Council, and a kind of an elaborate title. U.S. government, federal government agencies have a position known as the Executive Secretary of the Department, which is Chief Internal Management job for paperwork, for movement. I was the Deputy Exec Sec of the NSC, and my job was presidential visits and meetings, outbound and inbound. Who should see the president, for what purpose, what's supposed to happen in this meeting. So if the Japanese prime minister is coming to see the president, why? What is supposed to happen? What will allow us to constitute this meeting as a success, and what will allow the Japanese to constitute it as a success? So what has to happen in the set of meetings? How many meetings will we have? How long will they last? Will we have a state dinner on top of that? Is the spouse coming as well? What other cities are they going to? What core Japanese messages are going to be articulated in the course of this visit? And what are our main themes as well? And of course, what you're really saying is, look, this is a multi-month process within the U.S. government to make sure we're harmonized and we can answer this question as sort of a corporate view on these set of issues. But it also means you better start the discussion with the Japanese Foreign Ministry several months out. Because we want everybody to feel good about the meeting. We want the meeting to allow us to get to where we want to go and want them to get where they want to go as well. As a friendly nation and a military ally, we want everybody to deem the meeting a success. So a lot of those kind of discussions and plans, the culmination of which my NSC time was the Reagan-Gorbachev summit in Reykjavik. And so that was a huge spin up as well. In the final 2 years, I was in the White House political office. I was director of the White House political office, and that had a lot to do with the president's political activities, as you might expect. But the centerpiece of that activity was President Reagan's support for his then vice president, George H.W. Bush, we know as Bush 41, who was running to succeed his boss against the Democratic governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. So that was the 1988 presidential race. So episodes and architecture from those four jobs, I think, populate the book. But there's not. But let me take a step back from that. I think that gives you context and just discuss the themes. And there are three presidential themes I want to bring out that I think every president has to deal with. The first theme, which I think allowed President Reagan in general to be successful, was economic stewardship, economic leadership and management. And I would say that no president is going to be deemed successful unless he has some kind of successful economic record. And what was striking to me when I looked at polling data, I looked at a lot of polling data from the re-elect in '84, was the enormous correlation, the very strong correlation between economic performance, economic approval, and overall job approval. So you would take a seemingly unrelated topic like, do you approve or disapprove of the presidential's policies in Central America? Fair question. That the response to that question would correlate very strongly with overall economic performance. So meaning if you're doing a good job in the economy, the public grants you latitude on other issues. You must be doing a good job in general. I can sense in my day-to-day life, my life is getting better, my life is okay, and what you're doing in other aspects of your job is sort of up to you. But if you're doing badly in the economy, watch out. And Reagan came in with a very high misery index, the combination of inflation and unemployment, which is part of the reason he was elected in 1980. And the Fed took a very aggressive policy to stomp on inflation, but that meant very high federal funds rates and real economic pain for '81, '82. That led to Democrats picking up in the House, and it led to all sorts of questions about Reagan's viability and Reagan's reelection. But as we got into '83, '84, the economy picked up, Reagan's numbers picked up. But if we took polls in '83, both Walter Mondale and one of his main rivals for the '84 nomination, Ohio Senator John Glenn, were running even or ahead of Reagan in '83, '84. By the time it came to election, Glenn was out of the picture, but Mondale was behind it. So I think Reagan had a few contributions in his economic policy, but there's, I think, two that we still debate today. One is the size and scope of federal government. That Reagan was the question about are government programs effective or ineffective, and to what extent, is a sort of enduring question. But Reagan was the first president since the inception of the modern state, since the New Deal and the Great Society. He was the first president to question, are these programs working the way we hope they would, and are there indirect cost or second order effects that might raise questions about the suitability or utility of these programs. But for about 60 years, from 1932, 50 years, 32, with Franklin Roosevelt through LBJ through 1980, we had ongoing expansion of government programs with the view that we could lift people out of poverty, give people better lives. And you'd say, look, in a lot of respects, those programs worked or might have worked or done their job. I think what we saw with Reagan is, yeah, there might be a role for them, but there might also be a tapering effect. There might also be diminishing marginal returns from them. And it called to my mind an anecdote from Robert Caro's biography of Lyndon Johnson. Why did Lyndon Johnson was basically a right of center Democrat, a conservative Democrat, but he became an ardent New Deal supporter, became an ardent supporter of FDR. And Caro said this was because of electrification, that it took to the mid-1930s for a majority of American households to be electrified. And LBJ is representing a rural Texas district. And he said, life without electricity is misery. Your well water is pulled up by hand. You have no light bulbs. You have no radio. You have no health care. You have no mobility. I mean, you have a very isolated 19th century life without electricity. FDR initiated the Rural Electrification Administration to provide low interest loans to rural communities to electrify and to transform people's lives. Transforms business, their economy, their health care, their ability to read. So it just changed people's lives. And so the REA, I think, is a good example of a government program, government intervention that really did make a difference, really did help people climb out of poverty. We still have the Rural Electrification Administration, and now it works on Wi-Fi, and it'll now offer a low interest loan to go from 5.0 to 6.0, and to say, well, that might be useful, that might be something you need. It's not the same as electrification. So there is a tapering effect in government programs. So that was one of Reagan's sort of intellectual contributions, and one of the questions he raised that I think we still grapple with today. And the second economic policy that he put in place was marginal tax rates. Do marginal tax rates matter as an incentive or a disincentive for economic activity? If we want more people to have jobs, more businesses to expand, more businesses to start up, more people to get promoted. If we want a dynamic economy, what kind of environment does there need to be in order to make that as easy as possible, as likely as possible to happen? And Reagan's view was, look, marginal tax rates is part of the decision process. People, if they risk their investment and if they put in the time to start their restaurant or their shoe shop or whatever, startup business, whatever they're doing, they want to get a return from that. And the higher the tax rates, the lower their return. When Reagan came into office, the highest marginal tax rate on personal income was 70%, 70. So that's just federal rates, right? If we add on what Sacramento takes and what Los Angeles City Hall takes, it's way above 70. So he said that's a punishing disincentive to open a business. So he took it down to 28%. So to say, if you've got an idea, if you've got money, we want you to use your idea, want you to start a business, want you to create jobs, produce something, make something, do something, and have a dynamic economy. So we had a huge economic lift on the back of those tax cuts. Now the highest marginal rate, I think, in federal is 37, I believe. Is that right, Diego? So it's not, so there's been bubbling up from where Reagan took it down, but it hasn't gone back up to 70. So I think there's a general consensus of 70 is a disincentive. So one issue that we saw in the 1980s, we still see today, is economic management stewardship. The second issue is international leadership. What is the United States' role in the world, and how do we best promote U.S. security and U.S. prosperity? Reagan was, I think we had 8 presidents in a row who served in uniform in World War II. Many, like Reagan, were not in combat, but we had every president from Eisenhower through George H.W. Bush served in uniform in World War II. So no surprise that their worldview and their approach to Cold War foreign policy was an evolution of World War II foreign policy, which is to say alliances matter. Let's find a way to work with like-minded nations. Let's work with other leading democracies and people who have similar viewpoints. Hard power matters. We better have a military capability that can push back against aggression. Treaties and territorial stability matters, that it is a warning signal when national sovereignty is violated by hostile power. We ought to take that seriously. Not that we have to intervene in every instance, but we have to be mindful of people that want to disrupt a stable international order. Global messaging matters, that if we don't have territorial ambitions and we support human rights and democracy, we have the moral high ground, so we should always try to attain that moral high ground, but that gives us reach. And all of these people came to political maturity in the 1950s and 1960s when the developing world was going through decolonization, and communism had a certain appeal to those constituencies. Communism had a certain reach and resonance with countries that had gone through colonialism or there was social economic disruption. And so the United States had to get into that game and had to contend against the appeal of communism. So all presidents came up through that system, and Reagan believed very much in participating in Cold War leadership along those same lines. Reagan had one or two additional contributions beyond what I just described. One was moving beyond containment. The dominant school of thought in Cold War foreign policy at that time he came to office was called containment, that because of the enormous risk of putting pressure on the Soviet Union, the possibility of nuclear war, the enormous cost of a major war in Europe, nobody thought it was wise to try to get in an arms race or open-ended confrontation with the Soviets. So containment was a view to say, we're just going to have to outlast them. We're just going to have to live with this. And over time, we believe democracy and market economics prevails. Reagan said that's not good enough. He said, I think we can outpace them. I think our economy can outperform them. Our technology can outperform them. We do have the moral high ground. We do have a better message for the developing world. So we ought to find a way to incrementally put pressure on them to raise the cost of their adventurism to see what happens. But let's not just stand still. Let's try to move ahead. Reagan's statement was, we win, they lose. So containment is not a morally acceptable approach. So he did. So he did all of that. And it wasn't during his administration, but it was in 1990 under George H.W. the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed. The third area, and then we can go to questions, Diego. The third area I want to touch on, because that's also quite relevant today, is the transition, Ronald Reagan's support for his then Vice President, George H.W. Bush. And I raise this as you'd say, well, that's to be expected, isn't it? Which I think at a certain level it is. But I raise this as something worth discussing because Bush's success in 1988 was the first time a sitting vice president had succeeded the president in 150 years. So what would strike us as a sort of a logical, if you more or less like an incumbent president, you more or less like his vice president. And if the president is deemed to be doing a good job, the vice president is sort of a natural heir. But it rarely happens. It rarely happens. It happens much more often through death in office, that Lyndon Johnson succeeds John F. Kennedy or Harry Truman succeeds Franklin Roosevelt, but it rarely happens in real life. And that's when I was in the White House political office, so I had a chance to work very closely with vice president's office and the president about thinking through what we're trying to do. And my interpretation is this, that the vice president, in the U.S. system, vice president has essentially no formal responsibilities. There's the 25th Amendment, there are some stipulated responsibilities, but essentially nothing, no day-to-day responsibilities or portfolio. So all this person is a force multiplier for his boss. All he is a way to increase the president's outreach and impact by taking on assignments and missions to support his president. So he only has one job. And his only job, his only political identity is to make his boss successful. And most of them do that or try to do that reasonably well. But the problem with that is you forgo your own identity. You have to subordinate your own political identity because all you're doing is supporting your boss. So the American public, even after 4 years or 8 years of service, has very little idea of who you are, what you stand for, or where you'd want to take America. So, and it's, and of course, you cannot develop your own political identity while you're the president, the sitting president, is still in office, because your only job is to support that person, not to say, well, I might disagree with him on some point. So you never rise to sort of public awareness the way you should as a candidate. And the only moment you have to make that transition from being a good, loyal, supportive vice president to being a presidential candidate is the moment where you accept your party's nomination. There you take off the hat of vice president and you put on the hat of presidential nominee. But that's only in the final few months of the entire presidency. But only at that moment does the general public accept the fact that you have your own identity, your own goals, your own agenda, your own ideal. And of course, having said that, you don't want to repudiate your boss, and you wouldn't be working for this person as vice president if you didn't by and large agree with your boss, but you also have to establish yourself as an independent thinker in your own right. So all of that is harder to do than it might seem. It requires a boss, a president who understands all of this and is basically thick-skinned and accepting of this transition. It requires disciplined teams that understand that it'd be foolish and self-defeating to break with that boss early, or to really try to find stark differentiation with the sitting president, say, I'm different. But at some point, you have to do it. You have to. And this came to mind, Diego. Not only did I think George H.W. Bush did it very well, and Ronald Reagan knew and agreed with basically everything I just articulated. He knew it was going to happen. It was part of his life that he has to leave the stage, and he has to do so gracefully, and he has to do so supporting his successor. But all of this came to mind last summer with Joe Biden's withdrawal and Kamala Harris's nomination. Well, to be fair to her, she didn't have any kind of runway. So to be fair to her, it was all shock treatment. But to my mind, she never successfully grappled with this enormous challenge of saying she'd been a loyal vice president, always supportive of her boss, but then she had to stand up and say, I love Joe Biden, and I think he did a great job as president, and now it's a new moment, and now we have to talk about what has to happen in America for the next 4 years. So she has to find a way to praise him and support him, but still differentiate herself and articulate some independent viewpoint, which I just don't think she ever rose to that level. And indeed, was it a CBS interview? There was one interview in which she was directly asked, in what ways would you differentiate yourself, or what ways would you adopt different policies than Joe Biden, which is, I think, a rather predictable question. And she said something like, I can't think of a single issue on which I would be different, which on the one hand is she passes the test on loyalty. As a loyal vice president, she's a loyal vice president. On the other hand, she fails the test of acting like a president. Because I think if you act that way, what you're really saying to the American audience is, don't think of me as a president. Don't think of me as a political leader who has my own ideas about where America needs to go. You need to think of me as being a subordinate factor to Joe Biden. That's what I wanted you to think of me, as a loyal supporter. And you say, well, that's kind of true, but it's not a compelling argument. But also the reason this comes up is not to get into make political statements, but I think this is going to be a conundrum of sorts for various reasons for J.D. Vance. Even assuming he's the nominee, he might be the nominee, he might not be the nominee, but he's got to deal with a boss who enjoys the spotlight, who has a very strong sense of his political identity, who is not inclined to leave the stage, is not inclined to gracefully pass the baton to another party. And I think there's going to be points of friction or unhappiness in that process. But we will see. We will see soon enough in 2 years. So those were sort of three carryover themes that I think were key drivers of presidential behavior in the 1980s, and also carry over to today's economic policy and performance, international leadership and alliance management, and then how does a president deal with succession? How does a president deal with his vice president? There you go. So I'd be very happy to get into those. And I know from my side conversations, people here have specific questions about Reagan or White House and so forth as well. So happy to get into that as well.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll take this off and then I'll walk around with the microphone.
Okay.
But we're talking about Reagan, but there's this looming shadow that's very large. It's the Trump administration.
Yeah.
The presidency that you describe,
Yeah.
and the posturing of the Republican Party has evolved so greatly in the last few decades.
Yes.
And Republicans at large still really revere Ronald Reagan as one of their best and their standard bearer. at the same time, many of those Republicans adopt policies that are very, contrasted to those that Reagan had.
Yeah.
Like the Reagan era Republicanism has died, but Reagan is still a revered, figure in the party. How do you square that circle for how they can still, revere him as an entity, but accept that their policies have shifted and they've adopted this real, American first populism?
Yeah. I think, by the way, I think that analysis is correct. I'd also say in a certain fashion that exact same analysis also applies to the Democratic Party. And I think there's sort of a parallel set of evolutions in both political parties that provide more latitude in decision making than historically we'd seen. For the Republicans, the big change, the big evolution was the end of the Cold War. And you see this shift in foreign policy thinking to say, look, we don't have a threat. We don't have an immediate threat the way we had for 45, 50 years during the Cold War. So a lot of the work we did in that period, a lot of the international architecture and treaties and forward deployment and military exercises and global messaging and foreign aid programs, a lot of that just doesn't play the role. It's just not as necessary as historically been. So if we're in a sunny period, we don't need to spend that kind of money. Now that, by the way, doesn't just apply to Trump. That also, I think, applied in a lot of respects to Biden and to Obama as well. He said, we are doing too much internationally, and the cost of international leadership exceed the benefits. So we're going to do less. We're smart about this. But Trump is the most theatrical about this. Trump is the most sort of acute about this. But I think, though, I think it's all unfortunate, but I think that allows the base to be more or less content to say, I guess if we're not paying a price for it, if there's no immediate bill being presented, then why not? Why not do less? And I think the Democrats have a somewhat parallel set of problems, which, I talked about the Great Depression, about Franklin Roosevelt's role. Look, over the decades, we entered an era of mass prosperity. We have a huge middle class and a lot of economic mobility. And so the misery argument you might have seen on the left in the 1930s, 40s, 60s to say, look, there's whole segments of American society that cannot participate in the American economy. And what the U.S. government has to do is come up with a mechanism that allows people to do that. To say, well, I think there's been enormous success with that. So it just doesn't have the same hold. The pure economic issues that propelled the Democrats to victory across 50 or 60 years no longer has that kind of hold. And in fact, some people who might be working class or middle class or lower middle class might even say, I find that sort of economic, class warfare unappealing. And what might be more appealing to me is the cultural issues, where I don't like sort of exotic approaches to popular culture that take me out of my comfort zone. So the Democrats, I think, have somewhat the same issue, that core or long-standing message of we stand for economic justice, we stand for helping poor people have a better life. It means less than it has. So you have more experimentation on the Democratic side as well. The other lesson I get from your question is, above all else, we have a presidential system. So it doesn't matter so much if most Republicans feel one way if the president doesn't feel that way. And he sets the tone, he sets the pace, he sets the legislative agenda, and he's a very powerful communicator. So even though, for example, you can look at polling data that shows most voters, most Americans are against tariffs, but Trump can carry the day on that issue, at least in the short run, just on his own personal force and personal wherewithal. It might get thrown out by the courts, but he's pushing the Republican Party, and I think he's pushing the country in a direction that's not very helpful.
Do you think he's pushing it a little bit more aggressively than previous presidencies? Because right now it feels like if Trump says something, Congress does it, to the extent where they've really ceded a lot of their power as a check on the presidency in a way that I don't even think we saw under the Biden administration when Pelosi had majority and Schumer had majority in their respective chambers.
Well, Trump uses friction as a management tool. Trump welcomes a level of friction. And I think it's the way he tests a lot of audiences or constituencies on their wherewithal to withstand pressure, withstand a disagreement, and not commenting on the wisdom of his policies, but just the tactical wisdom of friction. Sometimes he gets it right, as he just did with the budget showdown with the Democrats. He said, I've got a greater capacity to withstand the unhappiness from the shutdown than you do, so I can hold my breath longer than you, so you are going to fold in the end. And he was right. and sometimes he might get it wrong. I would say vis-a-vis China, where he said, I can impose friction on you and cost on you. And they said, well, we can do the same to you. And so we can immiserize both countries. And so Trump more or less folded, he kind of in a polite way, but he more or less pulled back from his imposed friction. So, but you can see his preferred tool in his toolbox is to say, let me make people unhappy and then see who moves my way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's very unusual as a management construct. I mean, most presidents believe in leading through, I would say the twin attributes of leadership that essentially every single president follows, except maybe the current one, is the twin pillars of leadership are you have to articulate a vision and you have to create a consensus for action. So it's communication as a mechanism of building a coalition, getting people behind you. So if you say, I think the Soviet Union is bad news and I think we need to have an arms build up and do some other steps to push back against them, you have to explain yourself. And you have to build support for your policies, and you have to work the Hill, and you have to give speeches, and you have to get the American people behind your policies. So it's a very different view of leadership than the president just saying, how can I make somebody unhappy, and how can I use that? I would say his initiatives with ICE in the urban, putatively dealing with urban crime. But he was deliberate. I think he did this regardless of validity of the issue, meaning is there urban crime or is it a problem? Or put that aside for a second, just to say I'm deliberately doing this in a way so as to establish friction with a mayor and let the mayor come back and be unhappy. So I'm deliberately being polarizing.
Well, thank you. We're gonna just go to audience questions now. I have a microphone, and so our friends online can hear us, but you're gonna have to still enunciate for those in the room. Anybody want to kick us off? Okay, I'll bring it over here.
Hi, Frank. Okay, I'll hold it. Hi, Frank. It's Keith. We spoke a little bit earlier. It's a really simple question. Would it be accurate to say that post-World War II, American military and economic dominance is fading?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. But to my mind, the fundamental model or logic of American leadership still holds. So if we constitute a smaller percentage of global GDP now than we did 20 years ago, that's sure true. All the more reason to find mechanisms to work with like-minded nations, to build economic relationships and collaborative frameworks, because what has not changed is that the general appeal of democracy and human rights and market economics is pervasive. So since we're the largest country in that space, we can be a leader of like-minded nations. So that to my mind held up very well during the Reagan era. I think it would still hold today. I mean, I think there's still considerable value in working with people who see the world the same way we see it.
Next question.
Something in the back.
Someone in the back. Okay, I'll come over that way. Feel free to stand up and I'll hand over this microphone to you.
Where's the mic part?
Yeah, you can just...
I wonder if you could talk about your memories from your time in the White House of the East Wing, and how much is the physical preservation of the East Wing or its loss important for the historical events that happened there during your time?
Yeah. There were two offices that were domiciled in the East Wing that I had regular interaction with. So you'd trudge over there when you had something going on. One was the First Lady's office. First Lady operated out of the East Wing. So her scheduler, her chief of staff, her team was all in the East Wing. And the second was the White House Military Office, WHAMO, that did a lot of support work. I mean, we know the military aides, the attachés that carry the football, but a lot of the communications and signaling and other things all run by the White House Military Office. And then Air Force One and the Nighthawk Squadron, the Marine helicopter squadron is all through there. So you need to work with these folks on projects. But I think your question had more to do with the architecture of that. I'm ambivalent about the changes. I don't oppose. I kind of like the conceptual idea that there should be some kind of state ballroom, because I was at state dinners and events where you're under a tent and you're on kind of uneven ground, and if the ground's a bit soggy, it's not the best. So I said, I think we can take it up a notch and have a formal ballroom setting. So I don't oppose that. I think there's a welcome element to that. My questions have more to do with things like, how is this financed, and is this a transparent mechanism, and just the architecture and interior decor and tastefulness of the structure. What I've seen, I'm very ambivalent about. I thought one of the great beauties of American public life was that our reflection of power was often understated, that there was a humility that went through a democratic culture, and I think it had a certain charm to it. So I would tell anybody that presidents shouldn't shout, they should speak in a normal tone of voice. And to my mind, that gold leaf is shouting. So I think you're better off being a welcoming but humble place of democracy rather than a Versailles type approach. So.
So as we know, like Trump is kind of like set out with these programs like Doge to kind of shrink the size of the bureaucracy, kind of like you mentioned Reagan did. I was kind of interested on your personal perspective. Like, what do you think about the size of the bureaucracy? Like, do you think it's a little bit too big and like slow moving? Or do you think it's like just right? Or do you think it should like expand a little more?
Yeah, no, I think there are a number of government programs that could be reduced or have better criteria and so forth. And I think, you know, almost every government program has some kind of genesis that is well-meaning and well-intentioned, and maybe it actually did some work, but then you wonder decades later, what extent are we helping people? What extent are we not helping people? And are there alternatives now with technology that might get us better results with less money? But you know, it's hard to have these conversations because anybody who's receiving money likes receiving the money. But I particularly take a look, there's this underclass in America. America, I think, is an enormously successful country, but if you're in that bottom decile, your life might be miserable. You know, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with where you are or how you're being treated or your opportunities. Maybe you're a high school dropout, maybe you're chronic unemployed, maybe there's a drug problem. There's something wrong. And I think we do a good job of alleviating misery in terms of providing housing and welfare for that bottom decile, but we do a really bad job of trying to integrate that group into the broader economy, broader society. So you're perpetuating the misery. You're alleviating it, but you're also perpetuating it. I think, you know, this might sound cynical, but I think the core message, think of somebody who's 30 years old and is a high school dropout and chronically unemployed, but lives in public housing and gets a welfare check and has been on welfare for 10 years. Our core message to that person who's been on welfare for 10 years is get ready for year 11. So, I mean, the good news, so to speak, is that person has some food and shelter. The bad news is there's no mechanism or effort or requirement that that person get a high school diploma or participate in society. Let me digress, take this question, digress for a second, and I'll give everybody in this room a hypothetical. I'm now going to put a spell on everybody in this room. Everybody in this room is now the exact same person you are today. You are now 30 years old. You never graduated from USC. You're a college dropout. And like the previous story, I'm going to make you a high school dropout. So you're a high school dropout, you're 30 years old, you're chronically unemployed, and you are the person in public housing in LA and you're getting welfare checks. So your life is pretty bad, but at least you have shelter and you have a welfare check. That's a pretty bad starting point. There's no joy in your life. There's no good news there. But I put the spell on you and this is where we all end up. And now I come back and see you in 90 days. How many people here would be in any kind of high school diploma program to say, I am not going to spend the next 50 years of my life on welfare and in public housing in LA. I'm going to go someplace with my life. I'm going to go to night school, weekend school, online school, some public library, someplace to get my GED. What percent of the people here in this room would make that transition? I know enough about USC to say I think the answer is pretty near 100%. But what that tells me, it has nothing to do with financial capital. It has to do with social capital, human capital. There's something in you that you know something about the way the world works. And you have some faith, if I get a high school diploma, I can do something with my life. And if I don't have a high school diploma, my life is very limited. I'm going to be trapped in this misery. So there's some inner spark that you have because of your upbringing. But that person who's now in the projects doesn't have that. There's nothing in that life, not a family structure or a role model or God knows what was wrong with the person's life, but that person is somewhat trapped by circumstances. So I think that is that's not any one president's problem, but boy, that is something society has yet to grapple with, about how do we help people at the very, very bottom get out of that kind of miserable situation. So an open question.
Hello.
Yeah.
Recently, Trump has put in some policies where he's now requiring people to have a work requirement or volunteer requirement to receive public assistance. Do you think that would help to motivate people?
Work requirement for?
For like health care, for food stamps. He's now putting in a requirement of 80 hours a month.
Yeah.
And so if you go to school or if you try to get a diploma or something like that, do you think that would incentivize people?
Yeah, I think we did that. I think that was Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich put in a workfare program in the 90s, and I think it did result in moving people. And by the way, I'll take it back to a human level of people in this room. There might actually be circumstances with people here in this room who've said, I am unemployed or without means and I have to live on a relative's basement, or somebody shows up in your place all of a sudden and says, guess what, I'm unemployed. And so I'm on your couch. And that happens sometimes in life. But at some point, usually somebody in that household says, we love you. You're going to mow the lawn. You're going to mow. There's things you have to do if you're here and you're not working. There's certain things you're going to have to do. So that's not a bad idea. And in fact, I think if you said the opposite message to that person, don't worry about a thing. You just stay on that couch. I'll mow the lawn for you. I think that's kind of the wrong message to give that person. So even with people we love, we say, I do love you. I do want to take care of you. There's certain requirements of performance that have to take place on this planet, and I want to see you participate. So.
Yeah, I'm interested in seeing how much that increases people going to school, because requirements supposed to go in place. I think next year it'll go in place. You need to actually do something as far as going to school or volunteering or working to get public assistance, and that was one of the big things that Democrats were upset about. So I want to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and there's many ways to go down this path, but I think. Look, think of this. You're talking to a friend or somebody you love who is a high school dropout, and there's two things you could say to that person. Don't worry, I love you. That's one thing you could say. Alternatively, you could say, yeah, I love you, but you need to worry. You dropped out of high school. There's got to be some way to get back in the game. So the first person thinks I'm being compassionate, and they are being compassionate. But there's a second order effect if you take the person off the hook. And the second answer, you're treating the person like an adult. Now, there's ways to say it that are gentle and kind and compassionate. So I'd always want to be friends. That person's going through a tough time and had to drop out of high school. I give that person some space. But I'd say sooner or later, my friend, you need to get that high school diploma. So I think having some requirements for performance helps everybody. Yes, please. Wait, let Diego. Oh, sorry. Okay.
This is a little bit of a deviation, but I know that you spent time in the Foreign Service, you served as ambassador, and kind of going off of his question in the back, do you feel that the restructuring and the shrinkage of the Foreign Service will eventually help or hurt our global credibility and our soft power?
Yeah, I think there are enormous problems and challenges now in U.S. foreign policy, but I don't think the size of the institution is going to be the primary driver of outcomes. And I think over 20 years, this kind of gets in the previous question, over 20 years, I think state went up about 50%, from 50,000 employees to 75,000 employees. And I don't think that materially gives you better outcomes. I think the fundamental question is really a policy question, not a personnel question. Do you believe in international leadership? And are you willing to accept the benefits of the leadership exceed the cost? Or do you say there's no value in this or limited value in this, so we're not going to do it? And I think that's the main problem we face, is we're withdrawing from international commitments and international patterns. But I don't think we've got a staffing shortage in terms of doing what we're doing. And if we end up, I'm not sure what Trump's numbers are, but if we end up taking it down a little, I don't think that's intrinsically automatically a bad idea. I think a bad idea is saying we place enormous value on NATO and our NATO relationships, and we want to keep those things going. And you could still say there's a burden sharing issue here, but intrinsically we like working with other democracies who believe in human rights and see the world much the same way we see it. That, I think, is a big problem. We step back from that. Yeah.
Thank you. Where do I talk? Right? Okay. So you knew President Reagan well.
Yeah.
If you had to look at a comp in today's political landscape in the United States, either in the Republican or the Democratic Party, because, as you mentioned, both parties are quite different, or if President Reagan was here today, who would be a politician that he would be supportive of, that's in line with his, who's most like him, or somebody he would support today, because it is a much different world.
It is a different world. And by the way, I don't think you start to see an answer to that question until we're through the midterms. And people, I don't blame a senator for acting like a senator. I don't blame a senator saying, look, my job here is to move the legislative process ahead, so I'm kind of a small picture guy in a bigger system. And that's their job. But if you want to be president, you better at some point after the midterm start speaking about national issues and where the country needs to go and speaking more elevated, more conceptually. We haven't seen that yet, but I'm not surprised. I can tell you last cycle, there were a number of people who appealed to me. I was first for Tim Scott. I thought he was great. He's just a really cool guy, very balanced guy, very thoughtful guy, great guy to have a conversation with. He underperformed the debates. He had a real tough time in the debates, and he faded. So he didn't even get to the caucuses. And he formally dropped out before the end of the off year. He didn't compete, said even in the caucuses. And then I switched to Nikki Haley, who I thought was terrific and was very active for her. But that only lasted a few months. I mean, Don, sort of Diego's point, all of the non-MAGA candidates together only got to something like 30% of the poll. It was Donald Trump's party. So he just dominated the entire campaign. Now, what is likely to happen in 28 is much more of an open question. Is there going to be fatigue with Trump just in terms of his behavior and his style, that people said, look, he's very stylized individual and has been hard to take, and I just want somebody who's more sedate? That could happen. Is there going to be performance issues having to do with the economy? Because if we see signs of softening and his favorables go down, as I mentioned earlier, that could easily happen. There could be health issues. It's sort of open question. But the point is, he might not have the leadership role in the party 2 years from now that he has today. And it might be a wide open field. And JD, for better or worse, is, handcuffed to this guy, right? Right now, I think it's enormously to his advantage. But that advantage might fade if Trump's popularity and the economy fade. He could have problems. And there might be more of an open fist fight, a traditional contest for the nomination.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're right over 6, so Frank, why don't you kick us away with some final remarks before we close out of our Zoom? And Frank will be sticking around to sign books. If you have questions at the end, feel free to save those for the book signing.
Thanks. Let me close with one story from the book. Yeah, and I'll hang around. People have other questions or want to sign books, we'll do it. I'll close with one story from the book, which kind of reflects Reagan's thought process. And it had some charm to it, and it also had some idiosyncrasies to it. But Reagan flies back to Washington, D.C. after 5 stops in California over 2 days, his final farewell to the voters of California. And he said, he had an interesting story. He said, I was governor here for 8 years, and I was succeeded by Jerry Brown. Very different politics. And Jerry Brown very quickly was able to unwind everything I did. So he said, I don't want that to happen at the presidential level. So I want to ask the people of California for support one last time, so that we don't have everything I've worked on for 8 years unwound by Michael Dukakis. He flies back and lands on the White House. They fly back the Air Force One to Andrews, takes the Marine One to the White House to the South Lawn. And what we typically did on the White House staff is you always greet the president. It's always a television visual that the president gets off the helicopter and there's a group of people, supporters cheering him and so forth. So he said, let's bring the staff out and welcome him back from his final campaign swing as president. So I said to my team, we're going to go out on the lawn and say hi to him. And you make up a sign because it is for the television cameras. And so I said, everybody make up a sign. Let's have a contest. Who can make up a sign that will get the president to come over to? Because he'll stop and chat with somebody, maybe 1 or 2 people out of 50 people, a few dozen people on the lawn. So who could be the best of 50 people? What can you say that is clever enough, creative enough, engaging enough, seductive enough? How well do you know Reagan and how well he thinks? What can you say? And I have to say, I have to confess, I was not particularly good or noteworthy at this exercise because my thoughts were very conventional. 4 more years, or Reagan hearts Bush, or win one for the Gipper, very conventional cheerleading kind of sloganeering stuff that's not really inspiring, but it'll do for the moment. The intern in our office won the prize, Scott Kafina, and he went right to Reagan's heart, said, keep away from current events, keep away from politics, go right to Reagan's heart. His sign just said, will you be my grandpa? I thought this was genius. I thought this was genius because Reagan had an emotional dimension. And what he's really saying is, look, politics is politics, the economy is the economy. I've got a hole in me. I've got a hole in me. Something is missing in my life. And you can fill that hole. Will you just come over here for a second? And Reagan did. Reagan went over and picked up. I don't think we ever told the president this was all a lie. The guy has a grandfather, but we just wanted to see, can we do that? But Reagan was great. Reagan had a lot of charm, a lot of sincerity, and he always believed in that human element of the office, too. So it really made you really warm to the guy over time. That there was something very special about the way he viewed human beings that you just kind of fell in love with him. So it's been great. Thank you. Thank you, Diego, for moderating this. Thank you, everybody, for being a good audience. I'll stay and sign books. Talk more about the president.
Well, Frank Lavin, thank you for joining us at the center, and thank you for joining us as a fellow. To those of you watching us live on Zoom or Facebook, thank you for tuning in. To those of you listening to us after the fact on our podcast, we're so glad that you joined us. I would like to remind everybody that USC Center for the Political Future is hosting our annual Warsaw Conference on Practical Politics, Tuesday, November 18th. This is USC's premier political conference, and it's one of the largest on this side of the United States happening this year. We have really large political icons like Biden's senior advisor, Mike Donnellan, his director of the White House Domestic Policy Council, Neera Tanden, John Favreau, the host of Pod Save America, is going to be there. And on the other side of the aisle, we have Mark Campbell, Ed Goes, some really amazing strategists who have been leading campaigns up and down the ballot across the United States. So please join us next Tuesday, and thank you again for coming.
Great. Thanks, buddy.